Our next speaker is Sonia Prasadam. Dr. Sonia Elizabeth Prasadam is a mental health therapist based in Coonoor, India, specializing in anxiety and the complexities surrounding performance and mental health. She holds a PhD in psychology from Christ University, Bangalore, where her research centered on the development of an intervention to address music performance anxiety in trainee musicians. Through her doctoral work, Dr. Prasadam identified perfectionism and shame as significant contributors to the onset and persistence of anxiety, a discovery that has informed her therapeutic practice. Dr. Prasadam's research has been published in journals like Current Psychology, and she is an active presenter at national and international conferences. Through her therapeutic work, she guides individuals in creating meaning from their past experiences while also helping them shape a sense of purpose for the future. She is deeply committed to fostering mental well being with a particular focus on helping individuals confront anxiety through understanding the role of underlying emotions like shame and the pursuit of perfection. Outside of her professional life, Dr. Prasadam is deeply engaged in her interdenominational church community, where she worships and actively supports her husband, who serves as both a pastor and the choir director. Her involvement in this faith community complements her work, adding depth to her commitment to personal growth and relational well being. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sonia Prasadam.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. David, for that very warm welcome. You've already heard a little bit about who I am, a little where I'm from. And these things are definitely going to be informing the way I take this talk today. And today we're going to be looking through what perfectionism can look like, the ugly parts of perfectionism, and what is going to be our saving grace. And to start off, I'd like to share a little memory from back when I was a child. So, this was when McDonald's first came to India. It had been there for a while, maybe a year or two, and was pretty hyped up. It's not a place where a middle class family like mine would visit often, but the rare time that we would go, my excitement was unreal. They would get me a burger, fries, and a softy ice cream, and I'd be so excited. And I'd often ask to get the Happy Meal for the toy that they would indulge in every once in a while. Now, the slide up here is what was advertised. And I think this is the Maharaja Mac. It's the Indian version of maybe the Big Mac. And it looked so delicious. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure that what I ended up getting was this. Yet every time that I entered into one of these stores, there was a sense of joy, and I wanted to keep going back. Probably because the memory I hold includes an experience that was more than this burger. Stay with me till the end of this talk to make sense of this McDonald's experience and how it connects with our experience of striving for perfection and the role of grace in failure. Now, through this talk, I'm going to walk you through the portrayal of perfection in the Bible and in the church, the heaviness that comes along with being perfect humans, the role that shame plays in tricking us into perfection, and we'll also look at how and why perfectionism is prevalent among Asians. And we'll finally dive into the process of practically receiving grace. Now, here are a few of the many passages that give a glimpse into the perfection that lies in God. Right from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus asked the people to be perfect like the Heavenly Father. To Peter, sharing with the early Christians the need to not be conformed to their previous lives and to be holy like their God. To Paul, urging the church to pursue a life of excellence. Now, the early Christians needed these instructions back then, and so do we need it right now. One, to remind us that our Creator, the pilot of our life, is error-free. And two, to give us something to work toward. Now, these verses are something like the picture on the front cover of a 1,000-piece puzzle box. Without this picture, you would not know where to begin and what you might need to be doing differently to help you finish this. The problem arises, though, when through the pursuit of excellence, it becomes more about I need to be capable of this come what may, and anything less is not going to be accepted. So much so, the I becomes so large that it might seem like you hold all the power and God is the most powerless. Um, I'm guilty too of singing out loud. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry a lot for the thing I've made it, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. And then right after church, waiting to hear from the congregation about how well I led the worship team, or beating myself up because I sang off key at a certain part. And this brings me to church. Now, this, of course, is a picture of the congregation and the church that I go to currently. Um, it's called Ashray Fellowship and it's situated in Coonoor, where I currently live. But I grew up in Bombay and I had different churches that I attended, but I mostly grew up Methodist. And then I moved to Bangalore, where I studied, got married, started working. And that's where I was able to attend a Reformed Presbyterian church. And now, as I was growing up, as much as I remember our leaders and mentors saying, remember that all that you do is for the glory of God, I also remember hearing, make sure you offer nothing less than your best to God. And while that could be well meaning, it could also make us feel terrible at times when we didn't do our best and probably didn't please God. And listening to, the talk in the first two sessions as well, I did hear a lot of you in the audience talking about trauma in the church and how shame is associated with Christianity as well. And so I won't be surprised if some of you here have had a similar experience. I know clients of mine who I've worked with who mentioned not going to church because the people of the church are hypocrites, or not going to church because they feel like it's exhausting to always have a mask on. And this is probably the result again of people viewing the church as being a place where inadequacies can't be seen and should only house people who live holy or perfect lives. Now, if you are in a church where you see these instances or hints of fostering maladaptive perfection, I'm not suggesting that you begin church hunting, because here's the thing. Like everything else, having a perfect church will never be a reality. But as we grow in our faith and as we grow in our Christian walk, it will help to see how we can continue to work on our perfection to help people around us. And also to kind of work on perfectionism that we might see around us. Now, I started exploring the world of perfectionism when I began my doctoral research on social anxiety, specifically music performance anxiety in student musicians. And through interviews, I found how distressing this anxiety was for them, to the extent of feeling like they needed to drop out or they needed to choose another career path. And it was here that their belief of needing to be perfect or else I'll be critically judged emerged. Now, you might be wondering, how is this research relevant to everyday life? Think of your role as a parent, a spouse, a student, a pastor, a youth group leader. These are roles that you want to do your best in. While it might not be a performance in a literal sense, and your stage is very different, you can easily experience similar feelings as those young musicians. So, when we look at this definition of perfectionism that has been formed through many years of research, I would like you all to take these next few slides as a time of reflecting to see whether, hey, do I see this in myself or do I see this in loved ones around me, right? Because this is going to then help you map out how we're going to deal with it. So, two key words in this definition: high standards and critical evaluations. Are you setting standards that are impossible to achieve or very difficult to achieve? So much so that you're exhausted, that you're feeling tired. Or are you critically evaluating every single thing that you do to the extent where the joy of it, the meaning of it is lost, right? You're not experiencing that. Well, then it might be time to look into it, to look a little more deeply into it. Here, I'm not talking about, hey, I want to do better. That's not what I'm talking about. But what we're going to be talking about, hey, I want to do better. And if I don't, it sucks the life out of me. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, how does perfectionism kind of manifest? How does it look? Right. And here you can see there are three categories that they've found through years of research, through a lot of interviews with people, where we have certain traits, right, that could either be something that's self oriented, right? And that's where we have the self oriented perfectionism, where you are setting your own standards. So these are the people that would say, I don't care about what other people say, but I need to be the best. If I have got a certain grade or if I have given a certain sermon, I need to beat this. I cannot be at the same level. And if I am, or if I make errors, it means that I'm failing in that particular role. Or they would have other oriented perfectionism. This is where they are concerned about how others are performing and whether it meets their standards. And it makes them uncomfortable if those standards are not met. So, for instance, if let's say you are leading the service team at church, the setup team, sorry, and you realize that some of the tasks assigned to the other group members are not being done in the best way possible. And if this starts giving you anxiety, if this starts making you feel like, things are out of control, you start getting angry, you start getting frustrated, it might mean that this is the start of other oriented perfectionism. And then we have the last and the third one, which is socially prescribed perfectionism. Now, this is where you are overly concerned about how other people view you, how they feel about you. And so you feel that you need to be error free, you need to be perfect in order to be accepted, in order not to experience rejection from them. And so that becomes very important to you. Now, how do you know if a person is carrying this, whether they're self oriented, whether they're other oriented, whether they're socially prescribed? Again, you see on the right side here that we have perfectionistic self promotion. Are they constantly pushing up their successes? Are they constantly trying to talk about things that they're doing in the best way possible? Right? So, for instance, maybe a parent is constantly talking about how I have been able to, really train my child so well that, they're always obedient and they're always doing this and they're doing that. And they're only talking about these successes. Again, let me remind you that I am not saying don't talk about the successes, but is that the only thing you see in conversations? Right? The second is a non display of imperfections, where they are afraid to show their mistakes. And so they don't want to show it, they want to hide it. So this might mean that they don't take up opportunities where they feel they might make an error, right? Or if they do make an error, they make sure to justify it, to say that, hey, this was not a mistake and this was all right. And this was a trait that an experience that I saw very often with the participants that I was interviewing, the musicians, right, that who were experiencing this anxiety, where they would often talk about that. I actually don't mind making a mistake, but it would be great if no one noticed it. I don't want anyone to see this mistake, and that would put me at ease. And the final one here is the non-disclosure of imperfections. So this is where you don't want to talk about failures. You don't want to talk about times that were difficult for you. And I have a small event here. So a couple of years back, I was preparing for a national exam that would certify me to become an assistant professor at a university here in India. And it's a very difficult exam. It is something that, people really go after. And I passed the exam, and when I shared it with, people around me, everyone was excited for me. I was excited for me. But little did they know that I was actually not being completely truthful. And what I mean by this is that very few people knew something more about this. And it was only when they asked me, for instance, when they said that, "Hey, Sonia, congratulations on clearing this. Was this your first attempt?" I would sheepishly then say that, not really. This was actually my fourth attempt. But I didn't want to put that out there. I let it be. I let everyone celebrate it as if this was my first attempt and I am brilliant and I'm great. Right? I didn't want people to see me as someone who needed to give the exam 4 times. Right? And something that ties all of this together are these automatic thoughts, right? The thought that I need to be perfect. If I make a mistake, it means I'm not good enough. If I make a mistake, I'm going to be rejected. And so, a person who strives towards perfectionism, so much so that it's distressing, usually carries these thoughts around. And what's funny is that we are all here trying to be perfect beings, thinking that we are the only ones with inadequacies. But when we look around at the world, there's so much of imperfection that surrounds us. This is a picture of Mumbai, the city that I grew up in, the city that's my home. And you can see here that there is economic imperfection, right? You have these buildings, right, where the wealthy and some of the most richest people of the world live in. But you also have what we call as slums, the thatched roofs, the steel roofs, the plastic sheets, right? A perfect economic situation would be one where everyone was able to share resources, was able to grow together, develop together. But we see that that's not the reality of our world. Or if we had to go to this, and if I had to challenge everyone here in the room and even online, if I had to ask you, is there anyone here who has never been sick? And I'm sure the answer is no, that's not possible. I've had the sniffles, or I've had a throat infection, or I've had a larger disease, right? And so there have been moments where we've been in perfect health, but we also know our reality is that we've had moments of weakness where our health was not optimal. Um, and if we had to go here, the infrastructure that we see around us, right? Now, this is the Taj Mahal. It's an iconic monument in India, not one that I've visited yet, but I've heard that it's very beautiful and something that you need to visit at least once in your lifetime, right? So it's a timeless beauty, kind of, stood the test of time, still looks magnificent, still looks excellent. But we also have, and more commonly, structures that you see like this road here. It's the road right in front of the chapel, that's broken down, that's weathered, that we're still using every day, but it doesn't look perfect. And these were just few examples, and I'll be glad for those of you all virtually to put in more examples like these where we see so much of imperfection. Um, and if we have to look at these lovely, our favorite Bible characters, where Sarah, right, who felt like she was too old to conceive, to carry a child, her body would not be able to sustain it. Timothy, who felt that he was too young to lead the church, who felt he might be seen as inadequate or be taken for granted. Zacchaeus, who felt like he was too sinful to go near God. Gideon, feeling like he was the least of the family. Martha, who was distracted by her busyness, unable to sit with Jesus. Jeremiah, feeling incapable of being a prophet, doubting his speaking abilities. But here's the thing with all of them, none of them rejected God, and neither did God reject them. Now, as you find yourself, carrying this weight of perfectionism, or if you see others carrying it around you, you might see something else looming, close around them. These feelings of anxiety, dissatisfaction, and stress. Why then do you think they still choose to continue chasing perfection? Drum roll, please. Shame. Yes. That sneaky, icky, body consuming feeling of shame. Now, shame is one of the many self oriented feelings which depend highly on social interactions and evaluations. And shame is often interchangeably used with guilt. And I was actually able to see someone, I think someone called Terry, who had highlighted very well in the chat during Sangeeta's session that while, shame is about I did that horrible thing, guilt is more about I did that horrible thing. And so, since guilt involves behavior, most people respond with finding ways to repair. But with shame, it feels a lot more complex since it feels like the whole self is wrong. And so, hiding away or hiding these feelings of shame feels easier than repair. And this is where perfectionism enters in, where focusing on self um, and focusing on perfecting certain tasks and roles takes the spotlight away from being ashamed. Because trying to avoid any mistake or inadequacy, it feels like a foolproof plan to not experience shame again. But how does shame develop? Now, Eric Erikson highlights how through each stage of life, we work towards building virtues such as hope, will, competence, and many more that I will talk a little bit more of tomorrow. But today, I want to focus on stage two, where we're about 18 months or so having better motor skills, language, and more complex thought, and thus increasing the need for autonomy. For instance, let's say there's a 2 year old, right, who has just recently started going to public parks and spots a slide, right? And the 2 year old runs towards the slide and says, "Hey, I'm going to climb this." But when you look at the slide, it's a tall slide with steps that are, pretty far apart. So, as a parent, there are different ways in which you could respond. One is you respond in a way that provides opportunity for autonomy, while at the same time giving room for the child to experience shame and know that you're going to support that. So that response would look something like, okay, you can try climbing the slide, but if you need me, I'm going to be right here. So now the child knows that, okay, I am independent, I can try this, but maybe I'm going to fail, and my mom, dad is going to be around to help me through it. Or you could respond with, okay, you can go ahead and do it, right? And you still sit at a distance, right? And you're not really concerned about what's going to happen. Or you could respond with, no, please don't climb that slide up. It is not safe for you right now, right? This is not something that you can do. And you're too anxious about, how the child's going to climb up. Now, with those last two responses, there's now going to be a tendency for the child to be more impulsive, to take a lot of risks, right? Because they've not experienced support. Or they're going to withdraw, right? And they're going to avoid opportunities of engagement out of the fear of failing and not having support. A feeling of helplessness somehow emerges. And in adult years, this can then translate to avoiding any roles or tasks that might bring about failure. Now, you might have parents, right, who give opportunities for autonomy and provide support for experiences of shame too. Yet, they might be holding perfectionistic tendencies, right? And this could then lead to the child also feeling like they need to be perfect, right? And that's what Flynn and colleagues were able to see a positive correlation between parents who had perfectionistic tendencies and children who did too, right? Because the parent wants to portray themselves as being blemish free. For instance, I had this one client who was struggling to find a job, and it had been a couple of months. And the client mentioned that I'm just not able to talk to my parents, to my family. And so we explored a little bit more about, okay, how is your family supporting you right now? What's happening? How is your family responding to this? And then the client says that, yeah, my parents are actually very supportive and they understand what the job market is like right now, and so is my siblings. And then we had to unpack that a little bit more. And as we did, we realized that it was not the lack of support from the parents, but the client's perception of the family, of the parents, the siblings being perfect beings, where they were put on a pedestal, where they were blemish free. And here the client is experiencing failure and inadequacy, unlike what he thought, the parents or the siblings were experiencing. And so there was a need to hide away. Then there might be parents who don't necessarily cover up mistakes. They might even admit to their shortcomings, but they're so keen to make things right with their kids that they're always anxious that the child might mess up. They hyper focus on the child's shortcomings with the intention of hoping that their child turns out better. While it might seem like it is working, the child is now working out of anxiety. The anxiety that they might make their parent worry or disappoint them if they mess up. Now, I've put a lot of weight on the role of parenting and its connection to the development of shame. And my intention is not for you to have regrets from your childhood or currently have regrets as a parent. But like I spoke about the imperfections that lie in the church as they might battle perfectionistic tendencies, the same goes for parenting as well. None of us here have had the perfect childhood. While I might not struggle with shame, I do struggle with finding people trustworthy. And if I had to ask my parents something they struggled with, it would probably be being uncomfortable with the expressions of love and care. And the list goes on for generations before us and generations to come. Now, there might be some of you here who feel like my parents are supportive, they did not hyper focus on my mistakes, or they did not just present their perfect selves. Yet, I struggle with shame and perfectionistic tendencies. Well, it's because that it's not just our parents or caregivers, but it's also environments like school, church, extended family, community clubs that can contribute to it. For instance, according to the social learning theory and the experiments done, if children see only high standards that are rewarded, they will slowly start beginning to set high standards for themselves to receive that appreciation from teachers and peers. Further, as they build relationships with people outside of home, like their peers, their church leaders, they might also see that they need to be a certain way to be accepted, and this might be being perfect in the eye of the other. For instance, in the youth group, maybe they feel I need to be smart to give, smart answers. I need to ask smart questions. Only then will I be accepted into this group. And so the need for perfection kind of rises. Right. So this is the illustration of the little tree with branches of shame and different fears of our life. And some of the roots, I've only been able to highlight a few. There are so many more that I'm sure you can continue the discussion with. But these are a few that are important. Now, apart from this, there is a larger system that might be at play in the development of perfectionism, and that is our culture, specifically our Asian culture. Now, my experience is going to be based on me being South Asian and working with clients in the same ethnicity. But my reading suggests that this experience might be similar across most Asian cultures. Please feel free to share in the chat box if you agree with these similarities or see anything different from your cultural lens. Perfectionism usually is associated with individualistic tendencies, where the focus is on self and standing out. However, research has shown that perfectionistic tendencies also exist among Asians. And as I dig deeper into and reflect back on client stories, while dependency is a part of our culture and we don't necessarily need to stand out or figure things out ourselves, we hold a stronger trait, which is maintaining family honor. And I've been able to kind of bring out a word in Hindi that reflects that, which is izzat, right? And so family izzat, that's something that's very important in our culture, where this dependency means that successes and failures now become a we thing. I've had clients that are constantly trying to strive towards what next, finding it difficult to find peace with where they are. And often we'd be able to see hidden fears of being rejected by the family if they weren't in a good relationship or a job or a school. And this would mostly be a perception rather than a reality, mainly because of the emphasis on interconnectedness. Um, and so there is the need to maintain this izzat in order to avoid shame or what we call lajja, right? And in the Indian culture, shame, you might actually see it being celebrated, especially for women, right? And so they're celebrating and saying that a woman needs to have lajja, needs to have shame, because that's the only way to maintain honor. So while it might seem like, hey, they're actually promoting and encouraging shame and they're not shunning it away, the purpose of doing it is to restrict, to have certain boundaries to the person. When you look at studies of immigrants, you will see that usually immigrants are seen to have better health outcomes as compared to those who are born in the country, right? Who are probably born in the US. Now, researchers many years ago have labeled this as the immigrant paradox, and it's mostly associated with health outcomes. While some of the explanations are, only the fittest are selected and granted permission to migrate, or there's a sense of hope with new beginnings, or there might be cultural practices like dependence on family and extended family that help them kind of transition. I found an interesting study that showed immigrants reporting similar symptoms of depression and anxiety as compared to their US born counterparts. However, the impairment caused by these symptoms was significantly lower for the immigrants as compared to those born in the US. And so this makes us think whether the shame of being seen as weak or unwell is so high that striving for excellence seems easier, hiding the symptoms seems easier. And I'm really curious to know if any of you have noticed this in your homes or church communities, because this has been from my readings. And I would love to kind of hear from you all in our post discussions about this. You could even leave it again in the chat box to continue the discussion. Seeing now how the church, parenting, peers, community, and culture can contribute to the development of shame, therein promoting perfection, what do we do with this information? Well, thankfully, the Bible is not just like the cover of a 1,000-piece puzzle, but it also comes with some detailed information, like some of these verses here, where we see that failing, falling, being weak is very much part of our stories. In fact, it is a necessary part of our story. I'd like to demonstrate this with a little act. I hope you all can see this, right? Here I have a glass, it has some water in it. I'd like you to imagine this glass as being you, right? And the water in it, right, which is right up to here, as being your abilities, your strengths. And all of this empty space here as being your inadequacies, your weaknesses, and your failures. Now, you could try to continue to work on these weaknesses by yourself, right? By probably just tossing the water, trying to get the level a little higher and higher. But that can be exhausting. Or you could say, hey, I need you, Lord. And you find that your pretty ordinary water turning vibrant, right? Filling up, raising that ability, even overflowing in certain instances. And the dissatisfaction that you might have experienced now might disappear. Remember the inadequacies of Gideon, Jeremiah, Martha. There was one other common thing that tied them all together. And this was, and I think you all also spoke about this in the previous sessions, they made these known. They made their doubts and their inadequacies known. And God restored them in ways unimaginable. A few years ago, while I was doing a small group study with the women in my church in Bangalore, I had the privilege of going through a gospel centered study guide, and I truly understood how knowing and believing in Christ meant two things: a growing awareness of God's holiness, which simultaneously brought to awareness my sinfulness. Now, as lovely and as neat as this diagram looks, I was also quick to understand that it won't always steadily increase. Where there are going to be instances where I might shrink the gospel by either minimizing God's holiness or elevating my own righteousness. As scary as it sounds, perfectionism in some way can lead to us shrinking the gospel, where we might be caught up in being the best pastor, the best parent, the best teacher, the best student, to the extent of neglecting the presence of a holy God and brushing off our inadequacies. But sanctification, which begins with the act of the cross, is an ongoing process. The progressive nature of sanctification is also shown in passages where we see the growth of the new self. In Colossians 3 9 to 10, Paul reminds his readers that they have taken off the old self and have to put on the new self. The new self that they put on has been described as one which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Right? It's in continuous present tense. We're constantly being renewed. And this new self includes this awareness of God's holiness and our sinfulness and inadequacies. Perfectionism can bring out sinfulness and show our inadequacies when it holds us as being the most righteous or thinking that we can be the most righteous. What then is sanctification going to look like while we battle with these perfectionistic tendencies? Now, this is where we need to bring back shame. Shame is that bridge that is going to help us experience God's sanctification within us. For instance, I'd like for you to say out loud if you are in person or put in the chat box some states of physical discomfort that you can think of. I'm going to give you a minute to do this. Think of states of physical discomfort that you might have experienced. I'm just trying to go to the chat box. Okay, I can see someone say stomachache, muscle soreness, joint pain. Looks like all of us are in our 30s, 40s, 50s. Fatigue from it being a long day, nausea. Yeah, so that's right. We experience this tiredness, hunger, headaches, thirst, nausea. And what do? We depend on resources outside of us, like maybe a medication, a massage for all those joint pains that we've been experiencing, some food, some water, or we might even depend on resources within us, like our ability to take deep breaths, right? Our ability to rest, our ability to spend time with God, our ability to pray, to read scripture. So here's a proposal. What if shame could be one of the many discomforts of life that we experience, and we respond to it with dependence rather than running away or covering it up with perfectionistic tendencies? Now, I know this talk has thrown the spotlight back at you. I'm not letting you stay in that relaxed post-lunch state. But here's one more question that I'd like you to respond to. At what stage do you think you have been the most dependent? Or at what stage do you think we as humans are the most dependent? Can you put that in the chat box? At what stage of life do you think we are the most dependent? And again, people in the hall, please feel free to say the answers out loud. Okay, I can hear I can see infancy, old age, newborn, when we're the most vulnerable and weak, newborn and older age. Okay, looks like I'm guessing that's what people in the hall are also saying. But here's another. What if I tell you that the amount we are dependent is pretty consistent throughout our lives? But how we show the dependence and what we are dependent on might differ. So if you see here, right, these are just stages that I've put up here. You'll see that we are dependent on our caregivers to take in food, water, and experience rest. So physical needs are, right there in front. We're very extremely dependent on the other to receive that. But as we grow older, we might be able to eat by ourselves, and we might be able to sleep by ourselves, and we might be able to clean ourselves. But we are still dependent on our caregivers, on our parents to provide financial support, right? Additionally, we're also dependent on others to support us through our emotional needs, to feel loved, to feel a sense of care, to express tears, to express anger, to have someone hold these emotions for us. You see, the list goes on. As teens, we are dependent on role models and to build our self-image. We're dependent on peers to feel a sense of belonging. In middle adulthood, we're dependent on our careers to feel secure, or we're dependent on our roles of being caregivers to feel a sense of purpose. It's almost as if dependence is in our DNA. But somehow, most of us here are hesitant to depend, especially in our adult years. Hesitant to depend in case we are seen as inadequate. But we are called to be dependent. We are called to show our weakness. Because that's the one thing that ties all these needs together, and that is our spiritual needs. That's something that's going to be consistent throughout all of these areas. Our dependence on God, our experience of sanctification, our experience of grace. I'd like you to think back to some of your previous seasons of life. You'll realize that you couldn't really depend on the other to fulfill all your needs, right? Maybe you experienced loneliness in your early 20s, or there was your expression of distressing emotions that was dismissed. And yet you are here today feeling like you were able to overcome that. And that's nothing but the grace of God. It might take the form of feeling a sense of peace or acceptance, or it might be having certain people in your life take you through it. Whatever it is, you did not do it alone. Now, this is a slide that I've made by myself, and it is open to a lot of additions, right? This was my experience, my perceptions. But I'm sure as you look at this, you realize that this is not an exhaustive, it is a list that can keep going on, right? There are so many more needs. But we also see again that not all of these needs are met. And that's where we know how much of dependence we require, rather than trying to continue chasing the vacuum that we feel. Now, how is it, or what does dependence look like? It could look like slowing down. And I know Carissa kind of spoke a lot about that, right? About just the rest that you require, the repair that you require, rather than constantly trying to adapt, right? Slowing down so you can experience the peace of God. You might begin feeling restless when you slow down. Maybe read scripture to strengthen it. And soon you'll feel that sense of peace, the peace that you are enough. It could also look like depending on your community, not just to cheer you on, but maybe to actually help you in areas where you feel inadequate. For instance, maybe as a pastor, you're suddenly overworking because you feel the congregation needs more and you need to be that, to be the perfect pastor, to be the best that they have. But there are many options here. Are there other pastors in your team who can address these needs as well? Let them step in. Or could you take a break from a few of your responsibilities? As a therapist, for me, that is seeking supervision, knowing that there are areas that I'm still inadequate in. Because sometimes I find myself trying to secretly be the best therapist, only to feel extreme anxiety before sessions, or just the tendency to avoid having a session for that particular week, the fear of failing my client. As a Sunday school teacher, it meant asking the parents of my toddler group if anyone was good with art and craft, and if they could help me execute some great ideas that I had, but find very hard to make it a reality. Even as I say this, please know that I'm not endorsing giving up as being cool. These are for moments where you realize that the joy from the task has reduced or it no longer exists, and instead you're only experiencing more and more shame, you're running more and more towards perfection. That's the point at which you need to pause and depend. Sometimes you might not need to depend on community, but find ways to bring back joy or discover meaning of the process rather than the outcome. So, going back to my McDonald's experience, the one that still makes me feel like a child, warm and fuzzy. The burgers are no better. In fact, they're smaller and they're more dry. But that's not all to the experience. It was the experience of togetherness as a family. It was the outing, the novelty of the food that I didn't usually get as a child. And it was being treated with something special and in the process, feeling special. So, my dear friends, failure might look a lot like that second burger, and it might make you feel shameful. But what more is there to the story? If you are a parent who sees being in control as ideal, but you realize you aren't always able to be in control, what else makes you a parent apart from that? Maybe it's your ability to connect or your ability to be silly. When you discover what that is, being in control will now no longer have the pressure to be evident all the time, right? It'll feel okay getting up from failure. If you're an educator, being the most knowledgeable might be the end goal. But as you find yourself spending hours lost preparing for a lecture, maybe pause and reflect back on what are some other parts of you that make your job meaningful. Maybe your attention to detail or storytelling or incorporating the creative arts. And seeing that there is more to you in a particular role eases you into that role, reducing the pressure and anxiety around the need to be perfect. As we come to the end of this talk, I make no promises that your perfectionistic traits are going to disappear if you practice all of this, or your anxiety will no longer exist. But what can possibly happen is you will now identify perfectionistic tendencies and let yourself experience the shame. So that just as you respond to thirst by drinking water either immediately or maybe a while later, so will you hopefully respond to perfectionistic tendencies as an opportunity to experience sanctification, where God works and you depend again and again and again until we are one with Christ. I leave you with these two questions that you can carry out in discussions with each other post the session as well, right? How do we create an environment that celebrates dependence so that people feel more comfortable to depend? And second, how does spiritual dependence manifest across these different life stages? How does it look, right? Because it will differ. It exists, but it will differ. How has it looked for you? How has it looked for people around you? With that, I would like to end my talk and thank you all for being a part of it.
It was a lovely talk, so profound. I'm sort of regretting our time crunch on the schedule because I would love to just spend, and this is with all the talks I've heard today, an hour to debrief with our audience in person and online with such lessons. First Corinthians 4:7 came to my mind as I was listening, Sonia. What do you have that you have not received? This is a theology of grace, and a theology of grace means we are ultimately dependent upon God's gifts, and God loves to give gifts. So I want to just encourage our AirMeet attendees to make their way to the Q&A thread and to begin to share comments and or questions and to upvote them. And also encourage folks here in Princeton to think of a question and or comment. Um, Sonia, I'll begin. I really appreciate how the response to perfectionism is not imperfectionism, but rather dependence. So it's not like you're saying aim to fail, right? Like instead of aim to succeed, you're not saying that. You're saying um, dependence is much more aligned with our humanity. So here's my question for you, Sonia. Would you want to define Christian perfectionism as inclusive of dependence? In other words, are you trying to throw away perfectionism in total, or is the Christian version of it inclusive of dependence? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Okay. I hope I've understood your question right. Now, I think as I mentioned, it's not about the act of being perfect, right, which is problematic, but it's about the act of being perfect alone that is problematic, right? Where that's where we're talking about I'm bigger, I'm better, Because as I showed you, in reality, we are not always going to succeed. And so when we fail, we're again kind of beating ourselves up. But in as Christians, right, when we do have a desire to be perfect, we do have a desire to be better, to be the best version of ourselves, to always be reminded that there needs to be dependence in that equation for us to experience it fully. So that even when we do experience failure, or even when we do stumble and fall, we are doing it knowing that we are rooted in support, we are rooted in dependence with God, right? So, again, to answer that, I am not saying don't aim to be good, don't aim to be excellent, but do it knowing that we can't do it alone. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I'd love to just connect with Shreya. Shreya, are there any comments that you saw during the presentation that you might want to lift up? And if so, flag Easton down. And we welcome questions or comments from the floor as well as from Irmi. We have a question here in the room. And your name, please?
My name is Jacqueline Glass. I'd like to thank you for the presentation. I'm someone that struggles with perfectionism, but I want you to bring into the conversation perfectionism and OCD. I mean, does that
Mhm.
go hand in hand, or how does that work together?
Mhm.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Jacqueline. So yes, when we talk about OCD and we talk about it as being a clinical disorder, and there is a lot of rewiring in the brain as well. But we have seen in research that OCD also stems from a lot of anxieties, right? Which include feeling a loss of control, which include rejection, which include feeling, a disengagement with the environment around them. And so, because it stems from that anxiety, there is a very high need to engage in things that are perfect, with the largest being that, okay, if it's perfect, I am being in control and I'm feeling a sense of control, right? And more often, I would, just based on people that I've seen and research that I've read, is that for when we think about these compulsions, right, and we think about these obsessive thoughts, a lot of it is very self oriented, right? It's about I need to be perfect. It doesn't matter what people around me are saying, but when I am engaging in this, I feel a lot less anxious, right? And so there's not so much about, okay, what are other people going to think? Because when you think of people who are, either engaging in a lot of repetitive actions, or they're constantly engaging in things that we call as unusual, they don't seem bothered by what other people are saying. They're still engaging in it. And I think the root of that is wanting to feel a sense of control, where they might have had experiences in their life where they lost that. And this is their way of repairing it, right? And so that's how I would see it in connection with perfectionism. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I'd love to take a question from Irmi. Shreya, is there one that you'd like to pull up? Thank you. This is from Annalisa. How did you share your personal newfound realizations on healing perfectionism with your family or other members who still embodied the culture of shame and perfectionism? What kind of language or actions reach their ears and sink into their hearts?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, So I think this will also connect to that discussion question that I put up, right? To create first an environment where someone can be dependent, feel comfortable being dependent. And I think one way to start off this conversation is by admitting your own failures, right? You begin, right? You know the power of it, right? Maybe they're not yet ready to talk about their failures. But the more that family listens, that hey, okay, Sonia seems to have, seems to have struggled with this, right? Or if my clients hear that I've struggled with this as well, it makes it easier for them to now say that, okay, maybe I can share this, knowing that you've gone through this struggle. So I would say the key is to begin by talking about your own failures. And I'm sure you're not going to have a dearth of that, right? There's going to be enough for you to share about. And so when you begin with that, you're saying that I've experienced this and I've tried doing this, and this is how I've depended. And that will ease them into now saying that, okay, if you've experienced this, maybe I can share a little bit more and I might be able to bring the shame to light.
I'm recognizing the time. And Sonia, you're making me think a lot about grace. The Reformed tradition talks a lot about the covenant of grace, divine grace. What I'm hearing through your comments is the challenge faith leaders, pastors have in creating a culture of dependence that reflects grace. In other words, it's easy to talk about the doctrine of grace through our sermons. It's another thing to incarnate that socially in our communal relationships when we have a shame incentive structure to not be vulnerable, to hide our weaknesses because of the shame incentive, right? So I would again want to put this out there for our audience. I'd love to hear some church practices that we can begin to feel like do out of a strict reading of scripture. Like this is the doctrine of grace, but we're actually not practicing it in ways that are meaningful as Asian American Christians because we'd rather not be weak. We'd rather be strong, right? So I would really love to hear how churches can begin to change their culture. And another sort of takeaway from your talk that I wrote in my notes, Sonia, is you mentioned the non-display of imperfection and the non-disclosure of imperfection. And to me, I thought about whether it's in the family context or in the church context, we create a culture not just by our action, but also by what we don't do. And if we don't disclose or display our imperfection, that's saying something. Our kids see it and our parishioners see it. And so I think in order to shift the norms that are often implicit within our communities, these norms that shape our culture, we have to be really thoughtful about both what is unsaid and undone and what is said and done. At least that was my takeaway, Sonia. So let's give Sonia our thanks. Thank you, Sonia. And we'll begin to transition to our 30-minute break. So thank you, Sonia. Really appreciate it.